There's four questions today. Let's start with the first question. Between minimalism and consumerism, which concept people would prefer in the future? Well, um, so this is a really good question. And I think one has to ask the question of um, who is engaging in minimalism and consumerism, and try to imagine like whose future are you actually talking about. Um, and I think there's probably some analysis to be done with regards to who is more engaged with consumerism and who isn't, and so forth. So I think it really comes down to like what societies are we talking about and what consumers are we talking about. The second question is, should the interpretations we make inform and inspire a call to action in tackling these emerging issues? Well, I guess the question that I would have is, if we go back to CLA and start to think of the different layers, are we thinking about, um, what level are we thinking about? Is it the litany? Is it sort of the expert perspective? Is it the worldview? Is it the myths? And what are you actually interpreting? And, you know, what is the goal? I don't know if that makes sense. But, to what end? Like, why are you looking at minimalism and consumerism as future signs? You know, if you're looking at future signs, if you're looking at future signs for minimalism, I think the question would be like, is this a good thing or a bad thing? Is this something that you're trying to encourage or discourage? So I think a lot of it depends on to what end, or are you assuming that minimalism is going to take off? And if it does, how, like, what kind of products might you be designing that align themselves with minimalism? So, third question is, how can we curtail the negative effects of consumerism while still maintaining economic growth? Um, Here it gets really interesting. So there's certain economists, such as Thomas Piketty from France, who's done a lot of work looking at income inequality for the past, I think, close to 100 years all over the world. He won the Nobel Prize for this work. And he basically notices how economic growth has been based on population growth, to really boil it down. And so I think the question becomes, if what does growth look like without population growth? So the United Nations estimates that in 2050 we're going to reach capacity with 9 billion people on the planet. And so what does growth look like without adding more people to the planet, without adding the total number of people? And so there's other economists, such as Serge Latouche, who talks about like it's not slow growth, it's something like post growth. And so what does the economy look like after growth? And so I think these are really interesting questions. And so this consumerism is based on this idea that there's endless resources, but we don't have endless resources. And so those are some of the questions like around that. So I guess this question is really looking at, can you have consumerism getting rid of the negative impact of consumerism and still maintain economic growth? I think that's a great question. I don't think I really know the answer to it. I think the current paradigm that we're stuck in is that we can do consumerism, which is very wasteful, but I think this question is asking, is there a different paradigm for economic growth? I mentioned the word of Thomas Piketty, and I also mentioned the word of Serge Latouche, and he calls it the degrowth movement. So I think those are really great questions to think about. Let's look at the last question. How can we expect the issues with consumerism to change if we address them at an individual level and not a systemic level? And so this is a really great question. What the minimalists are doing by rejecting consumerism makes sense to me, but individuals don't perpetuate consumerism. Our economic system does, and is fundamentally based on consumerism continuing growing, therefore large businesses and wealthy people that run them perpetuate consumerism. How do we address those audiences? Well, I think one way of addressing the larger system would be to try to understand, doing a CLA analysis of minimalism and consumerism, and what does the everyday look like? What are the expert perspectives on consumerism and minimalism? And then, what are the worldviews that are connected? And what are the myths and the stories that help perpetuate those three upper layers? And so I think you'd have to do this for consumerism, and then also have to do it for minimalism. And then the question is, how do you get the elites to want to shift to a different kind of wealth growth system? I think that's ultimately the question. So thank you very much. I'll talk to you guys later.